The danger of reviewing a historically significant game like Final Fight is that it's very easy to just treat it like a museum piece and only discuss the ways in which it is historically significant or how it's influenced things after it. And while that's important to recognize because Final Fight is very historically significant, I think it also does the game a disservice because you end up walking away with the impression, either implied or outright stated, that Final Fight crawled so Devil May Cry can run, or that this era of game design is like prehistoric cave paintings to what we have now. And if you go back and look at them, oh, it's interesting, but it's not something that's going to hold up against modern action game design. And I really do not think this is the case. I've talked about this in previous videos where I think there is this misunderstanding of the history of game design as this linear, always progressing forward pattern of as technology has gotten more sophisticated, as graphics have improved, and as we've added more and more mechanics, this has just holistically improved game design. Where I think the reality is much more chaotic, where games come and go and they have real high points of concepts and ideas like Final Fight, like Street Fighter 2, but some of these ideas end up getting lost. Some of these ideas start to get unappreciated, and then the things replacing it, are they necessarily an improvement? Because if you only look at this era in terms of its gameplay mechanics, then you're not going to be able to appreciate or understand its overall quality and its strengths, because mechanics do not live in a vacuum. Their presence has an effect on all the other aspects of the game's design. And what has happened is that we've shifted away from mechanics being a part of a combat system to being the combat system. Now, what defines a game's combat and feel is purely looked at mechanically. And so mechanical limitation, especially in older games, is not viewed as a legitimate style. It's viewed as an absence of design, where I would view something like Final Fight as mechanical brutalism. It is developed exactly as effectively as it needs to be developed, and it works very well. I think the days of looking at action games and just judging them by if they're like Devil May Cry, I think these days need to come to an end, especially because we're seeing the flip side of what this looks like, and the fact that a lot of action games coming out now are completely unbalanced and just in the end fall apart because all the developers sit around thinking about is, well, what if we gave the player this attack and then this attack and then this attack? And the enemy design, the difficulty, the system just does not have an answer for any of this. And on a deeper level, it's not just that mechanics are overriding the fundamentals of spacing and hitbox interaction. We've gotten to the point now where they are just replacing that aspect of combat design. And so if you look at something like Final Fight, it functions spacing-wise like a Go board, where there is a ton of complexity, but it's all on this foundational layer of positioning. Whereas with a lot of modern action games now, I'm looking at footage for Fallen Feathers, look at how little the positioning matters. Everything just sucks into each other, and it's all about timed iframe parries or timed iframe dodges. And so we've shifted from being a Go board to being a Bop It. And a Bop It cannot have a higher level of complexity without just adding in more spinners and more mechanics. And so that's how you have this mechanical inflation where one mechanic overrides the fundamentals, and then another mechanic is needed to override that mechanic, and then another mechanic is needed to override the mechanic that's overriding the mechanic that's overriding the fundamentals. And so you get this layering of just these rock, paper, scissors to the point where spacing, movement, none of that really matters. So automate it away, make it suck to target, and you don't even have to worry. Just focus on the parries and the dodges. And I'm not saying that the less mechanics the game has, the better it is. Sometimes it feels like that's the case, but what I'm saying is that for every mechanic you add into the game, the rest of the game's design needs to account for that and to compensate for it. You need an overall holistic balance, and the more mechanics you're adding in, it's like the more ingredients you're adding into a dish. You can have a dish with tons of ingredients, but they need to all be in harmony and they need to all make sense. Also, as you add in more flavors, the less distinct each ingredient becomes. And so Final Fight, when you go back, you can see this is a very special era of game design because as they're setting up the foundations for these genres, they're looking at everything holistically. You can see this in developer interviews. The Final Fight devs said they wanted to take Double Dragon and improve it overall. So they weren't just taking some aspects of the game and adding in a thing here or there. They're changing the way hit detection works. They're changing on a fundamental coding level how they think this genre should be played. And then the mechanics of the game naturally flow outward from this vision. And that is why you find during the early eras of a lot of video game genres that the mechanics are discovered in this organic process. Like the way they discovered combos in Street Fighter 2 is they were playtesting and trying out ideas in Street Fighter 2, and in that process came across the concept of a combo and thought, this could really work. That is a very natural, organic way for mechanics to be formed and shaped, versus what we often see now is like millennial mixtapes where they think, okay, well, let's take one idea from here, let's take one idea from there, let's take another idea from here, and let's just throw them into the same game and it'll work, and it'll be this collage of mechanical ideas. But what often happens is that one of them starts to take over the design, or they don't actually blend as well as you would think, and so you don't have this more holistic, organic nature to the game's design like you had during these pioneering games, because they were coming up with the mechanics naturally. Another quality that made this era of games a lot different than what we see now is that the playtesting and the balancing was much more rigorous. This has been confirmed by the developer of Final Fight himself, and it shows in the overall product because a lot of the things that should be broken, the game seems to be aware of and seems to be counteracting against. And so that is the beauty of mechanical limitation, is that the game is more aware of itself and it's more able to respond to the things that you're doing. Whereas with a lot of modern action games, even ones that I really like, the game just is not able to respond because it hasn't been thoroughly explored in the same way. And the more mechanics you add in, the more opportunity for breaking things you'll find. One mechanic that should be broken and yet isn't is the infinite punch, or shifting as some people call it. If the other elements of the game were not well designed, so if the enemies weren't dynamic, if the enemies didn't react or didn't coordinate together, or if the space wasn't constrained, then this mechanic would destroy the balance of the game. But since the enemies are aware of when you're attacking and where you are facing, what they are able to do is not only do they have some built-in responses, like Slash will block the infinite and Poison will jump out of it, but even outside of that, you'll see all of the enemies sort of shifting around when you're doing the punch and always trying to flank to the back of you in order to attack you from your vulnerable side. And what's cool about the shifting style infinite is that, yes, it's very good when you have everything placed in front of you and everything locked down. But if you are interrupted, not only are you going to have to deal with the enemy attacking from behind, but now you have a giant army right at point blank range counterattacking you. So it's a high risk, high reward strategy, and something that really helps with the pace of the game. And interestingly, we think about how complex and sophisticated combo systems have become, and how since the prehistoric days of stuff like Final Fight, we've really developed this sophisticated combo mechanic tree and everything. But if you look at what this infinite mechanic is doing, going back to the brutalism of Final Fight, it is achieving a lot of the same dynamics as a combo system, but much more simply. And there is an execution element to this, by the way. It's not completely automated. So yeah, another mechanic that is similar to this, that is extremely popular, is the enemy step of Devil May Cry. If you look at how enemy step functions in Devil May Cry and how shifting functions in Final Fight, you'll see a very strong similarity between them. It's not necessary to beat the game, but it's certainly helpful. But it's also not just a free ride where you learn enemy step and boom, you've just solved Devil May Cry. And one of my favorite things about the shift mechanic is that it is a standing grounded cancel. It is not up in the air juggle style, so it keeps you in the fundamental spacing. And if Cody's style of gameplay isn't working for you, that's fine, because Final Fight also introduced character archetypes, at least what I can tell from my research. And so there is a whole different set of mechanics and styles of gameplay with our boy
Mike Hager.
And that is an archetype we are losing, by the way. Yes, we have shades of it, but especially in the Souls-like era, there's no grapplers, there's no suplexes and all this awesome stuff that you have here with Final Fight. And so what's amazing about this game's mechanical design is that it does have different options, but it keeps them balanced by containing them within character archetypes. This is something that we're losing, where now, instead of having distinct characters with their own strengths and limitations, a lot of action games are just giving one character all of the move sets and making them into this ultimate god character. You'll see this with Souls-likes, of course, because they're action RPGs, and so you have all the weapons, you have all the moves, you have all the stats. Nothing is getting broken down into a set of strengths and weaknesses, which means that enemies cannot react to the player's moveset. This is why I don't like style switching being modded into DMC3, because the style select is supposed to be different versions of Dante in that game. And say what you will about 4 and whether or not you like that version of Dante, but we do know in 3 that the game's enemy design and balance is not meant to handle Dante being able to have all the mechanics all together all at once. And so this is a perfect example of what I am saying with the obsession with mechanics over balance. Because how could adding even more mechanics all at once be a problem? Well, look at Final Fight. Look at how this game breaks up its busted mechanics into character types in order to maintain balance and also to create really distinctive play styles. It's super cool, and one of my favorite things about Final Fight that I don't think gets fully appreciated. And so depth is not just tied to what the player can do. It's also tied to how the enemies behave, how the levels behave, how the systems behave. And I think Final Fight really exemplifies this in a lot of really cool ways. First off is the enemy design. And yes, the enemies all look distinctive and iconic visually, but even more important to that is that each enemy type is their own archetype with their own game plan and their own sophisticated set of behaviors. And if you want a really detailed breakdown of the enemy behavior, definitely check out Boggs'
Beat 'em Ups 101.
Alright, earlier I mentioned modes or moods, so let's talk about them. Starting from the most obvious stuff, the aggression mode, where enemies aggressively move in to occupy a position slot and attack when they get in range. They can either stay there and keep attacking, they can do a combo and leave, for example jumping out, or they can do some other stuff, you know, it depends on the game. Then there's the mobility mode, or scatter mode as Pac-Man would call it. This is where the enemies really show their personality in beat-em-ups. They move outside of the player's range intentionally. It can be like circling the player, it can be moving slightly outside of the player's range, it can be picking a random.
And what you'll find playing the game is that they don't just have one specific set of behaviors that once you learn it, it's easily manipulatable. Not only do they have a distinct game plan that they're going to enact on you, but then they have their own contingency plans that adapt. And so even one-on-one, you'll find that the enemies are interacting with you beyond just this preset path that they'll follow. And then when you have multiple enemy types together, their game plans can synergize. So you get an Axel, an Andor, and a Poison. All of a sudden, if you're not prepared to not only deal with them individually, but then to deal with them as a group,
you're gonna die.
So a quick roll call, because it turns out Final Fight only has 7 enemy archetypes with multiple variations. But with just these 7 archetypes, plus the dynamic difficulty of rank changing their behavior, don't forget that, the game is able to create constantly fresh and unpredictable encounters because of the way they're able to synergize together. So you've got the basic bread guys, where they just hang around, try to get around you, and up close they'll do jabs or jumping kicks, but they're the fodder types of enemies. And then you've got the 2Ps and the Js. They are the footsie characters. They're constantly orbiting around you. They're really hard to get a hold of. They're slippery, and they counter hit you, and they open you up. And then you have the bulls, which early on in the game, they're kind of just big old punching bags. But as they get more aggressive, they become these stampeding nightmares that will come through waves of enemies, knock you out of what you're up to, and completely destroy you. Then you've got the Axles. They are the support enemy, where by themselves, they're not that threatening. They're pretty easy to pick off. You have to jump in and grab them. They're not very vulnerable to punching. They're able to block. But you get one of these guys around anyone else, especially some of the bigger enemies, and not only are they blocking your jabs and just being a menace defensively, but also if they get close to you, their attacks are hard to shut down once they get started, and they do a ton of damage. Then you have the famous poisons. Poison is the ultimate X Factor enemy, where by herself, she again isn't too threatening, but because she can jump out of infinites and also is constantly leaping out of position and over you and flanking, just chaotic and ends up being a very dangerous opponent. And then we have Hollywood, or as I call him, Knife Guy, the ultimate damaging enemy. He's got a knife that outranges your jabs, at least if you're Cody. He has a jumping slash attack that can activate off screen, by the way, that goes right over your jabs and causes all kinds of knockdowns and damage. And then if that isn't enough, he can actually punish with desperation attacks by just jabbing you or throwing knives at you. He is priority number 1, but since he knows that he's priority number 1, the ultimate glass cannon, he also has this nasty tendency to evade your attacks and let his bigger, tankier allies take the damage for him. And speaking of bigger, tankier allies, of course we have Andor, or if you're a Third Strike fan, Hugo, who is just the alpha unit in terms of knocking you out of the air. He can grab you, he can choke you, he can actually do this body slam when you're knocked down. He commands the room when he's present, but at the same time, he does a great job of protecting the more chaotic enemies like the poisons and like the Hollywoods. And so it's really amazing because all of the enemy types are so distinctive and coordinated. They are able to cover each other's weaknesses and buff each other's strengths. And it's never fully clear what enemy should be the top priority every single time. It depends on the situation. It depends on the context. It depends on the position. And this is something that is so distinct from a lot of modern enemy design we have now, where yes, on paper, there's technically tons of different enemy types, but they all have the same set of behavior. They all have the same game plan, essentially. It's just a question of how big and tanky are they, and do they have super armor? And what's great about Final Fight's enemy design, it doesn't rely on a lot of really chaotic RNG. There is RNG to Final Fight, but the way the RNG works is it isn't one big guess. Like you'll see in Tekken 8, right? The famous like casino fighter style where it's like, you guess right, you win, you guess wrong, you lose, and everything just boils down to this anti-skill coin flip. But in terms of a skill-based style of RNG, I don't think there is a better example than something like Final Fight, because the way the RNG works is all of the enemies will have different sets of patterns and behaviors, and what they will choose is based on all of these very detailed aspects of the situation, like where you're standing, when they appeared on screen, how far of a distance they are from the wall or whatever. Like there's lots of these very specific circumstances that create the enemy behavior. And an important note about the RNG of Final Fight is that yes, later action games, they also can have RNG and variance in the enemy behavior, but without the constraints of the movement, without the constraints of the mechanics, a lot of that RNG ends up being ultimately sort of meaningless. Whereas in Final Fight, because everything is so constrained and so precise, every slight variation becomes sharper in its effect. The difference between whether or not the enemy walks slightly forward or slightly backwards has meaningful consequences. And so it creates a demand for you as the player to become even more familiar with each slight edge case scenario, and you have to constantly create more and more backup routes and strategies to account for these variations. There's a funny example of this at the end of the subway in my 1cc, where I start off in my usual optimal setup, where if everything goes well, I just stand in place and lock the entire group with a single punch infinite. But what ended up happening is that the variance in the knife guy's movement caused him to walk lower on screen, and so I needed to then adjust my position to account for this. But since he was lower on screen, I ended up standing too close to a barrel, and so when I went to do the punch infinite, the barrel interrupted it, and then the Andor, seeing his opportunity, body checked me, and then as I stand up to try to then control the group, the bull comes and charges me. And all of this came about because of a slight change in the movement of the enemy. That's Final Fight, baby. And that's what's so fun about playing this game, and something I just do not find often with modern games. And I would say the best way to describe playing Final Fight and going for the 1cc and learning the game, which I really recommend all of you do, when you're on route and you've got everyone locked down and everything's going well, it's like putting your hand inside a hole in a dam. Everything's safe. But what often happens is you got that one hole plugged, but then there's like a crack, and then another crack, and then another hole bursts open, another hole bursts open. Then all of a sudden you went from being safe to getting just hit by a tsunami. That's what it feels like, and it can be frustrating, but at the same time, there's nothing more exhilarating. The things this game does in terms of the enemy behavior, I think still is pretty unmatched, especially now because the whole dynamic of most action games, like I commented on with The Rise of Ronin, is simply isolate and kill. You just separate out the enemies and kill them, and that's the predominant strategy, which would be fine as a concept, except the enemy AI does not account for this. The enemy AI doesn't counteract this. What should be happening, especially with a lot of these open world action games, is the enemies should stick together like glue. They should be like a phalanx, all together, because they know if you separate them out, they're dead. But what often happens is actually the opposite. Most enemy AI now just wanders off by itself, and you have this whole giant area of open space to pick them off. And so you're in an open field hunter, and everything's just walking right into your crosshairs. And so that brings us to the second aspect of Final Fight that I think is very important, the level design. Level design in enemy-based action games is interesting to analyze because a lot of it comes down to enemy placement, the size of enemy groups, and then the shape of the rooms. And so that's one reason why, in case you're wondering, the SNES port and most ports of Final Fight are absolute pieces of because most ports were not able to support the amount of enemies on screen as the arcade version, and they also couldn't support the same screen scroll size as the arcade version, which is really important of a dynamic of this game's level design, because not only are you juggling the amount of enemies that Final Fight places on screen, but you're also juggling this really cool dynamic of whether or not you should be advancing forward. Because in lesser action games, one strategy that is very predominant and overpowering is something that I call stepping. Basically, the idea is that you just slowly advance through the game, one enemy spawn at a time, and that will get you a much more consistent and reliable playthrough. It's the safe way to win. And a lot of modern retro stuff, like Contra Operation Galuga, doesn't know how to counteract this technique. And then on the flip side, you have the problem of the player just running past all of the enemies and going directly to the boss, which comes up a lot in modern games. Now, I talked all about this in my review of Dark Souls. That's the last video on the channel. And a big problem that Dark Souls has is it just struggles to stop you from running past everything. Well, let's take a look at Final Fight. What does Final Fight do about this? Well, first of all, you can't run past anything. There's no run mechanic. So there you go, another example of mechanical limitation being a good thing. What you can do is you can back jump past things. So you can turn around and jump backwards. Remember I said before about the beauty of playtesting your game, the beauty of balancing the game, and I think the developers being aware of these dynamics. So what does the game do? Well, it puts a lot of enemies that will block you from doing this, and it creates this amazing risk reward, especially on the wall of poison. You have two options. You either slowly fight the poisons one at a time, which takes forever, and also some of them do come together and the knife guy comes in, versus the alternative where you can back jump past the poisons. But because of the limitations of the back jump, where you're facing the wrong direction and the knife guys will outrange your back jumps, this means you have to take on this extreme risk of moving in this very vulnerable way. And if you're not fully precise, you're going to get caught, and then a wall of poisons will literally crush you as they fall on top of you, and you're in this ugly scramble situation. And there's all of these different ways you can approach this section. You can either go full commitment, full back jumping, just try to get past everything. You can kind of do a half measure, what I did in my 1cc, where you walk forward and you do like this controlled forward kick, and then you try to move around the wall of poison. Or you can slowly just try to fight things one bit at a time. But because the game's level design is really detailed and well made, it's not super clear what's the most effective strategy, and it sometimes comes down to your own preference and play style. So I ended up this kind of middle route, but I've seen guys do 1cc's where they do the full commitment back jump, and I've seen another guy do the traditional slowly fight them one by one, and that's a great example of level design in these genres at the best. And that's one of my favorite things about really well-made levels, is it's not totally clear all the time what's the best approach. And that's what actually creates depth, by the way. And one of my favorite sections is, of course, the elevator. I think beat 'em up elevators and action game elevators often tend to be very big standouts because they introduce a classic design element of shoot 'em ups, which is, of course, the auto scroll. Elevators auto scroll, and what makes that fun is that now everything is on a timer and every second counts, and it also links together multiple encounters into the same sequence in a set screen. The time it takes to take out that first encounter actually matters by the time the boss spawns at the end. And I love the balls of not putting a pause before the boss. The boss just Rolento just appears at the top of the elevator, and if you're not en route, you'll be fighting multiple guys and the boss together. And so it creates this amazing sequence where every second matters, and all of a sudden you can spend a ton of time routing not only what's the fastest way to kill people, what's the fastest way to get them into position, but also what's the most reliable way, since you have multiple encounters stacking on each other. And just for that extra bit of fun, the game introduces some RNG grenade throws so that you get everyone just in place. You're like, yes, I got him. And then a grenade rolls in the way and you got a desperation attack to get around it or whatever. It's just amazing and dynamic. And it's actually impressive how much the game emphasizes really specific spacing, because I spent hours working on this elevator and I found just putting myself slightly lower on the screen or slightly closer to the wall in certain encounters made a massive amount of difference. And that's just not something you see in modern action games. When was the last time you played a modern action game and you're like analyzing down to the tiles in the floor where you should be standing and the timing of everything? And that's a cool example of how a simple shift in a game's level design can create a whole new way to interact with its system. And speaking of system, I want to end this review by discussing Final Fight's systematic difficulty. Systematic difficulty is the difficulty of a game post-memorizing it and learning its basic layouts. And so I was saying in the Dark Souls review that the game itself has a lot of front-loaded difficulty where you need to memorize where to go and the patterns of the enemies and stuff like that. Once you know where to go and the enemy patterns, the game's systematic difficulty is rather easy, especially because it's progression-based and dying isn't that big of a deal. Well, Final Fight, being a Capcom arcade game, is full of systematic difficulty. First off, it uses permadeath. I've talked about this in my permadeath video. I think permadeath is such an important aspect of a game's identity that I think it is the dividing point between whether your game is a classically designed game or if it's a progression-based game. And so having permadeath puts Final Fight in the classic category. That isn't surprising. And so what that means is that you can't just separate the game into a set of isolated encounters. Every encounter builds and interacts with the other encounters because of the permadeath system. And so in my 1cc attempts, for example, if I died at any point up until the elevator section of stage 4, I would reset the run. Did I have to technically reset the run? No, but because of the permadeath system, I knew I needed all the resources I could have for the final stage. And so if I wanted to beat the final stage consistently, I could not be dying to stage 2 or to stage 3. But in a progression-based system without permadeath, you would just individually attack the stages. And so if I had one life even, it would still be easier and less of a test of consistency to just no death all the stages individually than it would be to 1cc all of the stages together in a sequence, even though you have a little bit of health and extends to play with. And so the permadeath system of Final Fight, that's very arcade oriented, but the game itself also has some extra layers that really make it work. Unlike most other beat 'em ups, I mentioned it earlier, Final Fight has rank, dynamic difficulty. The further you get into the game, the more difficult the enemies become, the more aggressive their behavior. And so what's interesting is that, yes, technically, the game introduces all of the enemy types in stage 2, and that was a deliberate choice from the developer to help you get acquainted with the enemy types early on, but you're not really fighting the same enemies throughout the game because their behavior is changing. If you are a fan of Godhand, and Mikami is a massive Final Fight fan, by the way, I believe he actually wanted to do a Final Fight game, but was unable to, and so like Godhand in some ways is obviously his little version of Final Fight. It has a rank bar. Rank is in Final Fight as well, and I think it's a very effective system, especially when paired with another smart choice, which is capped health. And what I mean by capped health is that a lot of beat 'em ups, even later Final Fight ports, like the awful SNES version and the pretty cool GBA version, instead of using capped health, they use a lot of life extends. And the problem with giving the player a bunch of life extends rather than capping the health is that when you get really good at the early part of the game, those saved extends will carry into the late game. And the dynamic this creates is that with a permadeath full run system, you will naturally start to optimize the early game because you're constantly playing the early game over and over. I got well acquainted with stage 2, let me tell you. But if you're able to then turn that optimization into survival resources, then when you get to the late game, that's actually diminished in difficulty because of the extra resources. But the way Final Fight does this is that it has a very aggressive cap to your extends. You only get 3 lives in the game, and that's it. And the rest is just health items. So you have some forgiveness, but that forgiveness is capped. And so if you are fully optimizing stage 2, that does not excuse you from the nail-biting anxiety of stage 6. And so it creates a really protected difficulty curve where every run is viable, but no run is guaranteed. And a lot of beat 'em ups, a lot of action games really struggle with this concept. So I would say in its natural state, the balance of the systematic difficulty of Final Fight is,
oh god, it's so good.
I say natural state because here comes the twist. In all of the ports of Final Fight, the arcade ports, the emulated ports, so the one on the 360, even the beat 'em up bundle, Final Fight is preserved in its natural dip switch extend settings. But for some insane reason, Capcom have decided in the definitive port of Final Fight, the port that I would normally recommend, the Arcade Stadium port, which has save state support, which has nice and low input latency. It runs at 4 frames of lag. I believe the arcade version runs at 3. It is really hard to confirm that, but Groovy MAME runs it at 3 with great filters, with online leaderboards, with a turbo mode. That's only $2. You can just basically buy the ROM is how it works. The Stadium version is amazing, except some idiot decided, you know what would be a good idea? You know how Final Fight is like really hard and everything? Why don't we change the default dip switch settings to give the player an extra life? And so if you have played the arcade version of Stadium in score attack mode, in default settings, in timed mode, and you got the 1cc, you didn't really get the 1cc because Capcom changed the balance of the game quietly all these years later, and it really annoys me, and I wanted to point this out because yes, of course, you can go into the options menu and put it back down, but that means the online leaderboards don't function this way, and it's obviously a deliberate choice, and it's the dumbest I have seen in a port in a really long time because it's so unnecessary.
No, this isn't happening. There's no reason for me to go on. What am I fighting for?
So, final thoughts on Final Fight. Yes, this game is very historically significant. Yes, this game essentially established the beat 'em up genre as we know it. Yes, this game heavily influenced Street Fighter II, which would then go on to heavily influence the entire fighting game genre. The amount of cultural impact of Final Fight is absurdly understated because whenever you look at like greatest games of all time list, it's never recognized despite being a foundational game for 2 key genres. And you could even say a third with the character action genre, DMC, because you can see the clear through line from Final Fight to fighting games to DMC, all within the Capcom library. You can see how important this game is historically, but outside of just that, this game needs to be played more. This game needs to be recognized more. How does it get so slept on? I have no idea. And so a massive recommendation from me. I would consider Final Fight essential reading, just like Resident Evil 4 or Ninja Gaiden 2. I mean, you've got to play Final Fight, and it's only $2 on the Arcade Stadium. And for the love of God, please do not play the SNES version. That has to be one of the worst ports of all time. I can't believe it doesn't get slammed more than it does. Like when people mention, oh, you know, the SNES port isn't ideal. I mean, they are underselling how awful of a port that is. But yeah, if you enjoyed this review, definitely check out my review of Dark Souls last week, because actually I think it's a cool counterpoint to a lot of the stuff we're talking here in Final Fight. And also check out my review of Doom: The Dark Ages for similar reasons, where you can see kind of a dichotomy between like a classic action game, beat 'em up, Final Fight, and kind of a newer style action game that's trying its best, but I think isn't quite as elegant. And so yeah, please like, subscribe, tell all your friends, and if you can, please support me on Patreon. I'm a full-time YouTuber, and so Patreon is how this channel happens. And actually, I have a full-on commentary and analysis of Final Fight on the Patreon that I think is pretty cool. Adios, everyone. So thank you to the $5 and $8 patrons, 100, Absconditis, Eternal Solitude, Handhold, AJA, AJD578, Alistair Stevenson, Alberto Starna, Aldrin, Alex, Alexander Pfeiffer, AMH, Anthony A, Arping Gordon, Arcade Hell, Arrow Viper, AU Li, Autonamed, Baron Metziger Stein, Battle Mode, Basil Me Dazzle, Bellator Poeta, Ben Foster, Benjamin Shabalski, Vito Dames, Bog Hog, Borky22, Brokeface, Brindale Swiftfoam, Bruh, Captain Rhodes, Catchright Studio, Chop, Shapelip, Kristen SoCal, Christopher R, Chronic Burnout 3, Cipolino 0404, Clara Cliff, Clarity, Clay Binkley, Climby Coyote, Coast, Concreted, Cooksan 666, Cooks and Soup, Corio, Corn Hoglin, Cozy, Crew Expendable, CSP 3900, Kudo, CRZ, Des Audio, DRK, Damian Thorne, Dat Mate, Danchi, Darren Griffin, Dat Guy, David Aldris, David Crespo, Dididum, Demian Smirnov, Desolus, Dimension Diver, Diodamke, DJ420 Praise It, Drano, Dr. Bosky, Duckies, Easter Egg, Eduardo Aquinta, Edvard, Elpin Stanisev, Elias Alonso, Epson Eagle, Eric Scrivener, Eric Houdini, Esteban Bazama, Eulogy 16, Evan Seifert, Explosive General Games, Fabio Pinchi, Falcus, Fenich Mathai, Perez, Fiskin, Five Side, Florida Sucks, Forbidden Dave, Frames Per Human, Francisco, Freckle Lord, Full Set, Gabriel Foreigner, Game Soup, Game Boy Gru, Gelhoff, Gettershine, Gojira Green, GPM, Gustavo Sanchez, Hawk, Hans Kowalski, HDZ 274, Hero Death, Hanharthi, HUD, Humongous, RNDMS, Italo Inferno, JDab, Jake Ryan, Jurgen, Jack Walsh, Jacob Grossman, Jacob Valenzuela, Jay McCarthy, J67, JLab, JBRPG, Jeremy Kellner, Jink Hans, JMD, JOH, John Kelly, John Longwalker, John Simpson, John Slaylise, Jorge Figueroa, Josaka, Josh Mayer, Josie, JT, Julian Elwood, Josie, JT, Julian Elwood, K, K2, Kane Evans, K-O-Tune, Ken 10082, Kill All Music, Kinstaro, Contain, Crazed Boys, Kuma Wamu, Kyarts, Kyral, Leonard McCoy, Lalberta, Lobos, Lula Lalich, LZR Cuter, Macabre Monster, Mad Combaticus, Malaise, Maplewood, Mario Simic, Markman, Mason Polar, Master Zeon, Matt O'Leary, Matthew Woodford, Matau Batau, Maze, Mekaroka, Minong, Meister, Men's Raya, Metal Slime Drummer, Michael Del Polito, Michael Faircloth, Michael McCord, Mig ZDM, Mike Mel, Milo Shamel, Mr. Mamma Mia, Mitwid, M. Kusanagi, Morog, Munro, Munsta Zero, Miles P, Mishkin, Naps91, Nathan Grimm, Nathaniel Davis, NCR Trooper Scout, Nico Pero, Neon Dagger Games, Nervous J, Nilfheim, Neo04, Nogden, Okla Kugels, Oleg Tolmasev, Panzer Dragoon Should Have Been Arcade, Patrick Baseman, Paul Jablonski, Paul Osterman, Powell Parole, Pedro Montoya, Pedro Isiles, Philip Plus, Pizza Belly, PLP, Poor Little Pigeon, Poorly Written Protagonist, PRK, Psycho Blizzard, Queen Charlene, Quilon Yeager, R2 Sinus, Raccoons, Raphael Trujillo, Randoom, Randy Leahy, Raul VP, Rapido, RC, Real Skeen, Rent Halt's Time, Repo Man, Retro Schmupper, Riff Mason, Robert Chang, Rope Hollander, Rory Starks, Rolf015, Running Aku, Salmon Connections, San Nevo, Sarn, Scanline City, Seymour, Segfault, Serial EXP Greg, Shader Bunny, Shazzy, Shift Delete, Shitsu Supreme, Shinjutsu 1600, Shmup Junkie, True, Simply Chrono, Surapong, Snowcrab, Social Kid, Sophisticated, Space, Spakeboard, Spiders STG, Spongy, Steady AI, Steppable, Steve Fiction, Street Magic, Superfunk, Swoop, Synthmilk, Tamzarian, Taze Ryu, Ted Ray 77, Dana Oat, The Dirty Screech, The Couchu, The N1, The Old Bensta, The Smartest Billy, Tom McCarthy, Tim French, T Money, Tofu Man, Tom Faze, Travis Arbon, Tristan, Zugumo, Turam, 2YU, Twest Please, Tyler Olu, Typo Air, Urokeeper, Ursua, Ushimushi, Vandal, Velenex, Video Game Enjoyer, Beautiful, Vlad STG, Wabby Legs, What Is This? William Miller, William Wallace, Yellow Tello, Your Nerdy Joe, Yeespurd, Zachary Patton, Zach, Zeal, Zenryoku, Zingus, Zerolux.